Somebody get me a doctor who speaks Japanese. Anybody. Please. Somebody. Dr. Karen Whitfield was running down the corridor of Mercy General, her white coat flapping behind her, her voice cracking against the fluorescent lights. Room 7 in the ICU held a 68-year-old man, Takeshi Yamamoto, founder of Yamamoto Medical Technologies, one of the largest surgical equipment manufacturers in East Asia. He had collapsed during a business trip to Baltimore. Cardiac event. Severe. His vitals were unstable, and the only person who could describe his medication history, his allergies, his prior surgeries was him. And he spoke no English. The translator service was down. The on-call interpreter had called in sick. The hospital's language line had a 40-minute wait. 40 minutes they did not have. A low voice from behind the nurse's station. I speak Japanese. I can help you. Karen spun around. Standing there with a mop in one hand and a yellow caution sign in the other was Eloise Tanner, 63 years old. Night shift janitor. Gray hair pulled back tight, hands rough from decades of bleach and bucket water. Karen looked at her uniform. Looked at the mop. Looked back at her face. You speak Japanese? Fluently. Karen almost laughed. Almost. But the monitor in room 7 beeped 3 times in rapid succession, and the laugh died in her throat. She pointed down the hall. Then move. Now. Eloise set the mop against the wall, walked into the ICU, pulled a chair beside the bed, and began speaking to Takeshi Yamamoto in a dialect so precise, so respectful, that the man's eyes, which had been wide with terror for 20 minutes, softened for the first time since he'd been wheeled through the doors. She got his medication list. She got his allergy history. She got the name and dosage of the blood thinner he'd been taking for 3 years. A detail that, had they administered the standard protocol without it, could have killed him. But that's not where this story begins. This story begins 14 hours earlier, in a supply closet on the 3rd floor of Mercy General Hospital, at 5:47 in the morning when Eloise Tanner was sorting industrial trash bags by size and listening to a medical lecture. In Japanese. The phone was propped against a jug of floor cleaner. The screen was cracked from corner to corner, held together by a strip of packing tape. The audio was tinny, barely audible over the ventilation system. But Eloise wasn't just listening. She was mouthing along with every word, pausing every few seconds to scribble something in a composition notebook she kept in the back pocket of her uniform pants. That notebook, if you picked it up, you'd think it belonged to a graduate student. Dense, meticulous pages of Japanese characters written in a hand so steady it looked printed. Grammar breakdowns. Medical terminology. Conjugation tables. And next to each entry, the same thing. A small check mark if she'd memorized it. A small X if she hadn't. And a date for when she planned to revisit. Eloise Tanner had been a janitor at Mercy General for 9 years. Before that, she cleaned office buildings downtown. Before that, elementary school. Before that, 2 restaurants that went under and a laundromat that didn't. 41 years of cleaning other people's spaces. That's what her resume said. But her resume didn't know what she carried. Here's what you need to understand about Eloise. She grew up in a neighborhood in West Baltimore where the row houses leaned into each other like tired old men. Her father left when she was 4. Her mother, Cora, worked 2 jobs. Days at a garment factory, nights cleaning a language school downtown, one of those places where diplomats and business executives came to learn before overseas postings. Every night Cora brought Eloise with her because there was no one else to watch her. So while Cora mopped the hallways, little Eloise sat in the back of empty classrooms surrounded by whiteboards still covered in Japanese characters, French verb charts, Mandarin tone diagrams. She didn't have toys. She had those whiteboards. By the time she was 8, she could read katakana. By 10, basic hiragana. Not because anyone taught her. Because she sat in those rooms night after night, copying what she saw, sounding out what she could, asking the occasional late-working instructor a question when they passed by. One of them, a retired professor named Mr. Ogawa, noticed her. He started leaving worksheets on the desk before he went home, face down, with a small note on top, for the girl who stays late. He never spoke to Eloise directly. She never thanked him in person. But every morning when he came back, the worksheets were completed. Every single one, filled out in careful pencil, slid under his office door. This went on for 3 years until the school closed. Eloise kept the last worksheet Mr. Ogawa left her. It was a translation exercise, an old Japanese proverb. The nail that sticks up gets hammered down. Below it, in his handwriting, he had added one line, but some nails hold the whole house together. She folded that worksheet into a square and tucked it inside a small tin box her mother kept on the kitchen shelf. That box also held Cora's employee badge from the garment factory, a button from the first coat Cora ever sewed, and a photograph of Eloise at age 6, sitting cross-legged on a classroom floor, staring up at a whiteboard full of Japanese characters with her mouth slightly open. That tin box sat on Eloise's nightstand for 40 years. She opened it every single morning, not to read the worksheet, just to touch it. Now, 6:15 in the morning. Mercy General. Eloise was pushing her cart down the east wing of the second floor. Mop, bucket, spray bottles, trash bags. The same cart she'd pushed every shift for 9 years. The wheels squeaked. They always squeaked. Maintenance had replaced them twice and they still squeaked. Eloise once joked to a coworker that her cart had a personality disorder. She passed room 214. The door was slightly open. Inside, she heard voices. 2 of them speaking Japanese, not the patient. Visitors. A woman and a younger man, likely the patient's wife and son. They were arguing, quietly, the way people argue in hospitals, where every word is sharp, but the volume stays low, because someone they love is lying 3 feet away connected to tubes. Eloise didn't stop walking, but she heard everything. The wife was saying that her husband had told the American doctors he had no drug allergies. But he did. He was severely allergic to a specific class of antibiotics, fluoroquinolones. He had been too proud to admit he didn't understand the intake form, so he checked no on every box. The son wanted to tell the nurse. The wife said no. It would embarrass him. He would be furious. They should wait until the translator came. Eloise's hands tightened on the cart handle. She kept walking. 3 more steps. 4. 5. Then she stopped. She backed up to the door. She knocked twice, softly. The wife looked up. Eloise bowed her head slightly, a small gesture, barely noticeable unless you understood its weight, and said in Japanese, calm and clear, "Excuse me. I don't mean to intrude. But I heard you mention a fluoroquinolone allergy. If that hasn't been recorded in his chart, it needs to be now. Not later. Now." The wife's mouth fell open. The son stood up from his chair. Neither of them spoke for 4 full seconds. Then the wife started crying. Not loud, just tears, sudden and silent, the kind that come when you've been holding something terrifying inside and someone finally sees it. Eloise stepped into the room. She took the wife's hand. She said very gently in Japanese, "Tell me everything. I'll make sure the nurses know." In 3 minutes, Eloise had the full medication history. She walked to the nurse's station, relayed every detail to the charge nurse, who updated the chart immediately. The antibiotic they'd been about to administer that morning was, in fact, a fluoroquinolone. They switched it. The patient never knew how close he came. Eloise went back to her cart and kept mopping. She didn't tell anyone what she'd done. She didn't file a report. She didn't mention it at the shift change meeting. She picked up her mop and moved to room 216. But someone saw. Doreen Price had been a respiratory therapist at Mercy General for 27 years. She knew every squeak in that building, every crack in every ceiling tile, every shortcut between floors. She'd been walking past room 214 when she saw Eloise standing at the bedside, speaking Japanese to the patient's wife with the kind of fluency that doesn't come from apps or weekend classes. Doreen stopped in the hallway. She watched for 10 seconds, then she walked away, slowly, without saying a word. She filed that moment away the way she filed everything, carefully, precisely, waiting for the right time. Now let me tell you about the other side of this hospital. Mercy General was in the middle of something enormous. A partnership. Yamamoto Medical Technologies wanted to establish its first North American training center, and Mercy General was the front-runner. The deal was worth $200 million over 10 years. New surgical suites, cutting-edge robotic equipment, a residency exchange program with 3 hospitals in Tokyo. The man leading the evaluation was Takeshi Yamamoto himself. He had flown in from Osaka specifically for this visit. He wanted to see the hospital in person, meet the leadership, walk the floors. He believed you could learn more about an institution from its hallways than its boardroom. On the hospital's side, the person managing the partnership was Dr. Karen Whitfield, Chief of Strategic Partnerships. Smart, polished, relentless. She had spent 6 months preparing for this visit. Every detail planned, every presentation rehearsed, every translator booked and confirmed, except the translator canceled the morning of, and the backup was unavailable, and the language line was jammed. Which brings us back to room 7 in the ICU, 7:42 in the evening, the moment Takeshi Yamamoto collapsed during a dinner meeting with the hospital board. The cardiac team stabilized him, but the communication gap was killing them. His medical history was locked behind a language barrier, and every second of guessing was a second they couldn't afford. That's when Eloise spoke up, and that's when Karen Whitfield looked at a janitor holding a mop and had to decide whether to trust her with the most important patient in the building. She chose yes. Not because she believed, because she had no other option. What happened next changed her mind. Eloise sat beside Takeshi Yamamoto's bed for 45 minutes. She translated his medical history in real time. Every medication, every prior procedure, every allergy, every concern his family had whispered in hallways but never told a doctor. She used medical terminology so precise that the attending cardiologist later said it was the most accurate live translation he'd ever worked with, including the professional services. But Eloise did something else. Something no translator would have done. She noticed that Yamamoto kept touching his left wrist, rubbing it, a small repetitive gesture that the medical team had dismissed as anxiety. Eloise asked him about it, in Japanese. Quietly, the way you ask someone something personal in a hospital bed. He told her, 3 months ago, he'd had a minor procedure on that wrist. A small cyst removal. The wound hadn't healed properly. He'd been taking an additional medication for it, one he hadn't mentioned to anyone because he considered it minor. It wasn't minor. The medication interacted with the cardiac drugs they were about to administer. If Eloise hadn't asked, if she hadn't noticed the small gesture, the interaction could have caused a fatal arrhythmia. She relayed the information. The team adjusted the protocol. Takeshi Yamamoto stabilized fully by 9 p.m. When it was over, when the machine stopped alarming and the room got quiet, Yamamoto looked at Eloise. His eyes were heavy. His voice was a thread. But he said one sentence, in Japanese, so softly only she could hear. You listen like someone who has been unheard. Eloise didn't respond. She just placed her hand on the bed rail for a moment, then stood, straightened her uniform, and walked out of the ICU. In the hallway, Karen Whitfield was waiting. Arms crossed. Face unreadable. Where did you learn to do that? Eloise looked at her. A classroom that was closed for the night. A woman who mopped the floors and brought her daughter to work. A man who left worksheets on a desk for a girl he never spoke to. Karen stared at her for a long moment. Then she said something Eloise didn't expect. I owe you an apology. For what? For almost not letting you in that room. She turned and walked toward the elevator. Eloise watched her go. Then she went back to the supply closet, picked up her mop, and finished her shift. But the story doesn't end there. It doesn't even pause. Eloise and stayed in morning, the hospital's main conference room. Takeshi Yamamoto, now stable and alert, was sitting upright in a wheelchair at the head of a long table, his son beside him, his wife behind him, his delegation of 4 executives lined against the wall. On the hospital's side, the board of directors, Karen Whitfield, the CFO, the chief medical officer, legal counsel, and a newly hired professional translator who had been flown in from DC overnight. The meeting was tense. Yamamoto had nearly died in their care. The deal was hanging by a thread. Karen's presentation was flawless, but Yamamoto wasn't looking at the slides. He wasn't looking at the translator. He was looking at the door. 20 minutes into the meeting, he raised his hand. The room went silent. He spoke one sentence. The professional translator opened his mouth. Yamamoto held up his hand again, stopped him. Then he looked at Karen and spoke in slow, careful English, the first English he had used since arriving. The woman. Last night. Where is she? Karen blinked. The janitor? Yes. Bring her. Karen hesitated. She glanced at the board. The CFO shifted in his seat. The chief medical officer looked at his hands. Karen picked up the phone. Eloise was in the basement folding rags when the call came. Her supervisor handed her the phone with a confused look. They want you upstairs. Conference room. Now. Eloise looked down at her uniform. Same gray scrubs she wore every shift. Bleach stain on the left knee. Rubber-soled shoes that had been resold once at a cobbler on North Avenue. The only cobbler left in that part of the city. The laces were mismatched. One black, one dark blue. Close enough that nobody noticed unless they looked. She didn't change. She didn't ask why. She took the elevator to the 6th floor and walked into a room full of suits. Every head turned. Yamamoto's wife stood up the moment she saw her. She crossed the room, took both of Eloise's hands in hers and bowed. Not a small bow. A deep, deliberate bow. The kind reserved for someone who has given you something you can never repay. The room watched in complete silence. Then Yamamoto spoke. His translator began to convert the words, but Eloise was already listening, already understanding. Her expression shifting with each sentence before the English version left the translator's mouth. Yamamoto said this. Last night, this woman saved my life. Not because it was her job, not because someone told her to. Because she chose to see me when I was invisible. She spoke my language when no one else could. She asked the question no one else thought to ask. And she did it in a uniform that told every person in this building she was not worth listening to. I have built a company across 4 countries. I have sat in rooms with prime ministers and board chairs. And I will tell you, the most competent person I have met in this hospital was holding a mop. He paused. The room was so quiet you could hear the air ducts. Then he turned to Karen Whitfield. The deal will move forward. But I have one condition. He pointed at Eloise. She is my point of contact. All communication between my team and this hospital goes through her. I don't care what her title is today. Change it, because I will not work with people who do not know the value of what they already have. The CFO opened his mouth. Karen raised her hand, stopped him. She looked at Eloise. Really looked, maybe for the first time. Then she nodded. Done. Now here's the part that stays with you. 3 weeks later, Eloise Tanner was given an office on the 4th floor of Mercy General Hospital. Small office. One window facing east, which meant morning light hit her desk at exactly 7:15 every day. On that desk, next to a new computer she was still learning to use, she placed 2 things. The tin box from her nightstand, and the composition notebook. Her new title was Cultural Liaison, International Partnerships Division. She didn't celebrate. She didn't post anything online. She went home that night to her apartment in Greenmount, fed her cat, made a pot of tea, sat at her kitchen table, and opened the tin box. She took out the folded worksheet. Mr. Ogawa's handwriting faded now, nearly 40 years old. The nail that sticks up gets hammered down, and below it, but some nails hold the whole house together. She held it for a long time. Then she opened the notebook, found a blank page, wrote one line. He was right. Doreen Price, the respiratory therapist who had watched Eloise translate in room 214 without saying a word, was promoted 3 months later to patient advocacy director. At the announcement, someone asked her what qualified her for the role. She said, "I spent 27 years learning how to see the people this hospital doesn't see." I'd like to make that official. Karen Whitfield never publicly addressed what had happened. Not in a speech, not in a memo. But she did one thing. She commissioned a new policy requiring every employee at Mercy General, from surgeons to custodial staff, to complete a skills and language inventory during onboarding. The form had one question at the bottom, in bold. Is there anything else you can do that we haven't asked about? That form is still in use today. And Takeshi Yamamoto returned to Osaka and told his board the story of the janitor who saved his life. Not as an anecdote, as a case study. He used it in his company's annual leadership address to 4,000 employees. The point he made was simple. If your organization cannot recognize talent in a janitor's uniform, it does not deserve the talent in a tailored suit. 6 months after the partnership was finalized, Yamamoto's company funded a new wing at Mercy General dedicated to international patient services. The plaque at the entrance reads, "Dedicated to those who speak when no one asks them to." Below the plaque in smaller letters, a name. The Eloise Tanner International Communication Center. Eloise named it after her mother, the woman who mopped floors at a language school and never learned a second language herself, but made sure her daughter sat in every empty classroom long enough to learn. Cora didn't live to see it. She passed 11 years before the plaque went up, but if you asked Eloise, she'd tell you her mother was there every night, in every vocabulary list, in every worksheet slid under a door, in every word Eloise ever learned in a language Cora couldn't speak. Now, let me leave you with this. There are roughly 7,000 languages spoken on this planet, and in hospitals, in courtrooms, in boardrooms, in classrooms, in every building where decisions get made about people's lives, there is almost always someone in the room who can bridge the gap. Someone who already knows the words. Someone who learned on their own, in the dark, without funding, without recognition, without anyone ever asking. They are pushing carts. They are folding laundry. They are emptying trash cans under fluorescent lights at 2 a.m. And they are waiting, not for permission, for someone to ask. Tomorrow, you are going to walk past someone invisible. A custodian buffing a hallway floor. A cafeteria worker sliding a tray across a counter. A security guard standing beside a door you walk through without looking up. You will see the uniform. You will not see what's underneath. Maybe they speak 3 languages. Maybe they studied law in another country. Maybe they compose music on a phone with a cracked screen during their lunch break. Maybe they know more about the building you work in than anyone with a corner office. You will never know. Not unless you stop. Not unless you look. Not unless you ask the one question no one ever asks. What else can you do? One worksheet left on a desk by a man who never said a word changed a girl's entire life. One question asked in a language no one expected changed a man's survival. One woman with a mop and a cracked phone and mismatched shoelaces held more knowledge in her back pocket than half the degrees hanging on the walls of that hospital. If you have ever been that person, the one no one asks, leave a comment. Tell me what you carry that nobody sees. Tell me the language you taught yourself. Tell me the skill you built in silence. And if someone you know needs to hear this today, send it to them. Let them know they are not invisible. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And remember this. The room didn't hand Eloise Tanner a microphone. She didn't wait for one. She spoke anyway. And the man whose life depended on it heard her. That's not luck. That's what happens when preparation meets a world that finally stops long enough to listen. The question isn't whether someone like Eloise exists near you. She does. The question is whether you're paying attention. The value of what you carry does not depend on who sees it. It depends on what you build when no one is watching.